Hey everyone, welcome to the second video for this week where we talk about the form of Shakespeare's sonnets. Now, as I mentioned in the last video, we are familiar with sonnets now, so we're going back to what we learned last week, especially focusing not on the Petrarchan sonnet with its octave sestet form, but to the English sonnet, which, as you might remember, has 3 quatrains and a couplet, and usually follows this rhyme scheme: A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Shakespeare tends to follow that pretty strictly. We saw earlier authors kind of deviate from that structure from time to time. Shakespeare's pretty interested in sticking to that pretty closely, so we'll see that a lot in his poems. Now, I want to highlight some poetic and rhetorical devices that we can find in Shakespeare's sonnets and that you can keep a lookout for as you're reading. So the first word here is not so much a poetic device, but a term that we use when we're talking about poetry, and that's the word speaker. When we read a sonnet, which is usually voiced in the first person, right? It says, I felt this way, I longed for this. Generally, literary scholars have decided that we shouldn't necessarily equate the author with the speaker, because the author could be creating a character, and this character could be very different from who the author, him or herself, is. So one way to avoid kind of automatically conflating the author and the speaker is to refer to this, I'm being redundant here, is to refer to the speaker as the speaker in the poem rather than the author. So, if we're looking at a certain sonnet, we could say, oh, the speaker says this, rather than say, oh, Shakespeare says this. So that's a little trick that we use in poetry to avoid making assumptions about whether the author is creating a character or voicing his or her own true emotions. Okay, on to some of these other poetic and rhetorical devices. The next is anaphora. You hear this a lot in political speeches. I left to know the truth. I left to learn about God. I left to fall in love. Again, another horrifically bad line of poetry that I put together to illustrate this feature of beginning a sentence with the same phrase or few words. We'll pretend these are 3 different sentences. If you begin 3 different lines or 2 lines or any number of lines with the same words, that's anaphora. Another trick is polysyndeton and asyndeton. Now, syndeton in Greek means conjunction. Poly means many, a means without. So here's an example of polysyndeton, or many conjunctions. I cried and wailed and begged. Even though that's not grammatically correct, if we were being strictly grammatical, we'd say, oh, you need to delete that first and. I cried, wailed, and begged. Well, a poet sometimes breaks those rules for rhetorical effect. So they might employ polysyndeton to say, oh, I cried and wailed and begged. It kind of exaggerates those feelings that you're feeling. The opposite is to remove all the conjunctions in asyndeton. I cried, wailed, begged. So you can keep a lookout for those features in Shakespeare's poetry. Oops. These 2 you might be familiar with. I know we've talked about alliteration. The lovely lady left her love. We've got the repeated consonants. Assonance is the version of alliteration for vowels, in which a vowel is repeated numerous times in a sentence. He had a bad dad with sad hats. That's assonance. And then finally, personification is usually when you transform something that's not a person into a person. Here's an example from Shakespeare in which time, which is not a person, has been made into like a real person. Devouring time, blunt thou the lion's paws. The speaker here is pleading with time to do something. So when you do that kind of thing, that's called personification. You can keep an eye out for these poetic devices as you're reading Shakespeare sonnets. Okay, I'll see you at the next video.